This presentation draws from peer-reviewed research published in Science, Nature, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Primary sources include Harvey Weiss, professor of Near Eastern Archaeology and Environmental Studies at Yale University, authored The Genesis and Collapse of Third Millennium North Mesopotamian Civilization, published in Science Volume 261 in 1993, and his comprehensive work, Megadrought and Collapse. From Early Agriculture to published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Additional references include Marie-Agnes Courty's soil science research from the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique in Paris, published findings from the International Union of Geological Sciences regarding the 4.2 Kiloyear event, and archaeological data from Tell Leilan excavations spanning decades of research in Syria. If you find this exploration of ancient climate catastrophe fascinating, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us continue bringing these deep investigations into humanity's past and what it reveals about our future. The year is 2200 BC. You wake to a sky the color of bone, the Akkadian Empire, the first true empire the world had ever known, stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Persia. Its cities bustled with merchants, scribes, administrators. Its granaries overflowed with wheat and barley from the fertile plains of northern Mesopotamia. For a century, this machine of civilization had run with ruthless efficiency. But that morning, in 2200 BC, something changed. The rains didn't come. Not that year, not the next year, not for 3 centuries. What happened in 2200 BC wasn't just a drought. It was a climatic rupture that would tear down empires, empty cities, and force hundreds of thousands to flee their ancestral lands. Scientists now call it the 4.2 Kiloyear event. The International Union of Geological Sciences has designated it as the marker of the Middle to Late Holocene transition, one of the most severe climatic events of the entire Holocene epoch. This is the story of the first climate collapse in human history, and it's a story written in dust, in abandoned cities, and in the desperate migrations of peoples who watched their world dry up and blow away. But before we understand the collapse, we need to understand what was lost. The Akkadian Empire emerged around 2300 BC under Sargon of Akkad. Archaeological evidence from Tell Leilan and sites across northern Mesopotamia shows this was no loose confederation. This was imperial control. The Akkadians of southern Mesopotamia conquered and imperialized the dry farming landscapes of the north, creating an empire that controlled roughly 30,000 square kilometers. Harvey Weiss's excavations at Tell Leilan reveal how total this control was. The site, located in what is now northeastern Syria, was transformed from a regional city into an imperial administrative center. Excavators found massive grain storage facilities, standardized pottery vessels exactly 1 liter in size for measuring rations of barley and oil. They found the remains of waterworks, channelized streams, administrative buildings with cuneiform tablets, recording shipments, and tribute. This was commodified agriculture on an imperial scale. The grain from thousands of hectares of northern plains flowed south to feed armies, administrators, craft specialists, surveyors, the entire apparatus of the empire. According to Weiss's research published in Science, the empire maintained a standing army and a hierarchy of officials sustainable and profitable for about 100 years. Tell Leilan itself sprawled across 250 acres, with straight paved streets, an acropolis with government buildings, residential quarters. The archaeological record shows a city at its peak, expanding, confident. And then the dust came. Make sure you're still subscribed, because what comes next will change how you think about civilization itself. Marie-Agnes Courty, a soil scientist working with Weiss's team, made the discovery that would rewrite our understanding of ancient collapse. Using microscopic analysis, she examined the sediment layers at Tell Leilan. What she found in the layers corresponding to around 2200 BC was extraordinary, a sudden appearance of wind-blown pellets and dust. Not the normal sediment of a functioning city, but the signature of catastrophic above the last floors of Akkadian buildings, above the last pottery, above the last signs of human occupation, lay a thick deposit of Aeolian dust. This wasn't gradual abandonment. This was abrupt. The occupants of Tell Leilan left their city. They left their grain stores, their administrative buildings, their homes, and for 300 years, the site was buried under windblown sand and dust, with virtually no trace of human habitation. The high-resolution radiocarbon dating, published by Weiss and his colleagues, pinned abandonment to approximately 2200 BC. The dust layer extends through roughly 3 centuries, matching precisely with what paleoclimatologists were finding in ocean sediments, lake cores, cave stalagmites, and glacial ice from across the Mediterranean, West Asia, and beyond. But Tell Leilan wasn't alone. Regional surveys of the Kavar Plains documented synchronous abandonment of settlement after settlement. Major urban centers went silent. The countryside emptied. Weiss estimates around 300,000 people were displaced from the zone of uncertainty in northern Mesopotamia alone. Other researchers suggest at least 126,000 fled, 99,000 from Upper Mesopotamia, 17,400 from the Middle Euphrates, approximately 10,000 from territories northeast to southeast of Idlib. Where did they go? Archaeological evidence shows desperate southern migration. Texts from southern Mesopotamia record the construction of a massive wall, 180 kilometers long, called the Repeller of the Amorites. This was built across central Mesopotamia to stem the tide of nomadic incursions from the north, people fleeing the megadrought, people whose farms had turned to dust. The Akkadian Empire tried to hold, but an empire built on agricultural tribute cannot survive when the agriculture fails. Around 2150 BC, the Gutian people from the Zagros Mountains defeated the demoralized Akkadian army. They took the capital city of Akkad. By 2115 BC, they had destroyed it utterly. The first empire in human history had fallen, not primarily to invasion, but to climate. But the megadrought wasn't contained to Mesopotamia. This was a hemispheric catastrophe. 800 kilometers to the southwest, Egypt was dying. The Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, had stood for half a millennium, from roughly 2700 to 2200 BC. Egypt had been the most stable, prosperous, organized state on earth. The pyramids at Giza, built during the 4th dynasty, testified to Egypt's organizational genius, its surplus wealth, its absolute central control. But that control depended on one thing: the annual flooding of the Nile. Every summer, monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands swelled the Blue Nile, and the combined flood of the Blue and White Nile inundated the farmlands of Egypt, depositing fresh, fertile silt. This was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Priests measured the flood levels at Nilometers up and down the river. Agricultural production, tax collection, the entire economy synchronized to this annual pulse. Geological evidence from Lake Tana in Ethiopia, the source of the Blue Nile, shows dramatic shallowing around 2200 BC. Cores from the Fayum oasis in Egypt indicate the lake there dried up entirely during the same period. The Nile floods were failing, according to research published in the Journal on Climate Change at the end of the Old Kingdom. 4 years between 2200 and 2150 BC, the normal flooding simply didn't happen. Have you hit that like button yet? This story gets even more intense. Tomb inscriptions from the end of the Old Kingdom speak of desperation. The tomb of Enctifi, a nomarch during what's called the First Intermediate Period, describes famine stalking the land. Ancient texts, though debated by scholars as possibly propagandistic, speak of civil conflict, of Egypt turning on itself. But here's what modern scholarship reveals: the Old Kingdom's collapse wasn't as sudden or chaotic as once thought. Thomas Schneider and other Egyptologists argue the transition was more complex than simple climate-triggered collapse. What happened was a dissolution of central authority. The position of nomarchs, the provincial governors, had become hereditary. As these regional administrators grew more powerful and the central government at Memphis weakened, especially under the long declining reign of Pharaoh Pepi II, Howard evolved. Nadine Moller's archaeological research at sites across Egypt shows no evidence of widespread civil war. What the evidence does show is decentralization. Local officials, who could respond faster to agricultural crises than distant Memphis, took control. Some regions adapted, others collapsed. The monumental architecture that had defined the Old Kingdom ceased. The next century saw Egypt fragment into competing power bases: Atarokle Palace in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt. The drought didn't destroy Egypt outright, but it shattered the conditions that had allowed centralized pharaonic power to exist. Egypt entered what's called the First Intermediate Period. From roughly 2181 to 2055 BC, it would take until around 2033. BC 4 Mentuhotep, the second to reunify the country under the Middle Kingdom. Meanwhile, 2,000 kilometers to the east, the Indus Valley Civilization was beginning its terminal decline. The Indus Civilization, contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, had built cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro with sophisticated urban planning, standardized weights and measures, advanced hydraulic engineering. This civilization had thrived in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, sustained by monsoon-fed rivers. But the same climatic shifts that weakened the Mediterranean westerlies and reduced rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands also disrupted the Indian summer monsoon. The Indian winter monsoon declined as well. Paleoclimatic records from Rara Lake show the drop in monsoon strength through low manganese titanium and manganese iron ratios in sediment core. The Gagahakra River system, which had sustained Indus agriculture, was rain-fed and dependent on monsoons. As the climate cooled and dried from around 1800 BC, the river retracted toward the Himalayan foothills. Floods became erratic, less extensive. Inundation agriculture, the foundation of Indus food production, became unsustainable. Unlike the Akkadians or Egyptians, the Indus civilization left no readable texts, no historical records. We know them only through archaeology. What that archaeology shows is gradual abandonment of urban centers, replacement by dispersed local cultures, population movement eastward and southeast following the retreating habitable zones. This was habitat tracking on a civilizational scale. Many scholars believe drought and declining trade with collapsing Egypt and Mesopotamia triggered the Indus collapse. The synchronicity is striking as global wind patterns shifted, as atmospheric circulation changed. Multiple cradles of civilization failed simultaneously. But it wasn't global, and that's important. Press that subscribe button if you want to understand how climate shapes human destiny. Climate data compiled by researchers and published in volumes edited by Harold Meller and others show the 4.2 Kiloyear evented regionally variable impacts. Parts of the Iberian Peninsula experienced two rapid dry phases from 2350 to 2200 BC and from 2100 to 2000 BC, followed by shifts toward wetter conditions. In Spain, settlement activity declined between 2300 and 2100 BC, and in some regions, like the Evora area, settlement collapsed entirely. But some societies adapted brilliantly. The Motillas of La Mancha in Spain are extraordinary. These were fortified settlements built around wells, representing, according to researchers, the oldest system of groundwater collection in the Iberian Peninsula. Their construction coincided directly with the 4.2 Kiloyear event. As surface water vanished, communities dug deep, accessing aquifers, surviving where others fled. The El Arger culture in southeastern Spain actually began to flourish around this time. Despite initial difficulties, they adapted to new conditions, developed new social structures. On the steppes of Eurasia, widespread aridification drove a fundamental transformation. The vegetation changed. Mobile pastoralism intensified. This period marks the transition to nomadic cattle breeding on the steppes, a way of life that would define Central Asian peoples for millennia. In China, around 2000 BC, widespread alternation of archaeological cultures occurred. The Longshan culture was replaced by the Erle-Tu culture, now acknowledged as the Xia culture in Chinese historiography. The transition wasn't necessarily collapse, but transformation, possibly hastened by climatic stress. Tree ring data from Irish bog oaks, analyzed by Dendro, show environmental disturbance beginning abruptly in 2206 BC and lasting until around 1900 BC. But this same research points to an even earlier event around 2354 to 2345 BC, suggesting the climate disruptions may have been more complex than a single event. So what caused this catastrophe? Climate modeling, published in peer-reviewed journals, points to multiple interacting factors. The evidence suggests significant weakening of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents that redistributes heat around the globe. When AMOC weakens, it disrupts global precipitation and temperature patterns. The intertropical convergence zone, the belt of low pressure and rainfall that girdles the tropics, shifted abruptly southward. This would explain reduced monsoon strength in both Africa and Asia. Evidence also indicates increased El Niño's southern oscillation variability played a role. Some researchers have proposed explosive volcanism in Iceland as a trigger, though the low sulfur content of Icelandic eruptions makes a prolonged global impact unlikely. Marie-Agnes Courty did find microscopic volcanic tephra at Tell Leilan, evidence of a distant eruption. But as Weiss notes in his publications, this alone couldn't explain a 300-year drought. The reality is probably cascading failures. A volcanic eruption triggers short-term cooling. This perturbs atmospheric circulation. The Atlantic overturning circulation weakens. Ocean heat distribution changes. Monsoon systems fail. And suddenly, from North Africa to China, from the Mediterranean to the Indus, the climate regime that had sustained Bronze Age civilizations shifted. The megadrought lasted from approximately 2200 to 1900 BC. For those 3 centuries, the dust accumulated at Tell Leilan. The Nile continued to fail. The Indus cities slowly emptied, and then, around 1900 BC, it ended like that. Subscribe button. Seriously. This is where it gets hopeful. The return of rainfall around 1900 BC is as clearly marked in the geological record as its departure. Tell Leilan, new settlement, appears above the dust layer. But it's not Akkadian. The old empire was gone. What returned was different. Smaller communities, more mobile populations, a new social order. Weiss calls this the resettlement. Within a few generations, sedentary populations began reoccupying the northern plains. But these weren't imperial subjects. These were the descendants of refugees who had survived in riparian zones around springs in highland they had adapted to pastoralism during the drought centuries. Now they were. This resettlement swiftly generated what Weiss describes as the famous warring kingdoms of the early 2nd millennium BC, including the empire of Shamshi-Adad of Assyria. Massive military struggles erupted across West Asia for control of newly productive rain-fed agricultural land. The Middle Bronze Age had begun, characterized by territorial kingdoms constantly at war. This was a different world from the centralized imperial systems that collapsed. Political organization had fundamentally changed. In Egypt, Mentuhotep II reunified the country around 2033 BC, establishing the Middle Kingdom. But Middle Kingdom Egypt was not Old Kingdom Egypt. The absolute divine kingship was tempered. Provincial nobles retained power. Literature from this period, including the famous tale of Sinahar, reflects a more complex society, less hierarchical, more aware of its own fragility. The Indus populations had dispersed. Some moved into the Ganges Valley. New cultures emerged. The old cities never revived, but the people survived, carrying their knowledge to new lands. This is the pattern. Collapse is not extinction. Societies are resilient, but they transform. What emerges after crisis rarely resembles what existed before. So what does 2200 BC teach us? First, climate changes abruptly. The transition wasn't gradual. Multiple proxy records show the megadrought onset was rapid, likely within a decade. Societies built on assumptions of climatic stability had no time to adapt gradually. Second, complexity is vulnerable. The Akkadian Empire, with its standardized measures, its its tribute collection systems, was optimized for one climate regime. When that regime shifted, the optimization became a liability. Smaller, more flexible communities survived better. Third, inequality. Kills, the nomarchs of Egypt survived the Old Kingdom's collapse because they had local power, local resources. The ordinary farmers, entirely dependent on central redistribution, suffered catastrophically. Social systems that concentrate resources at the top fail hard when the bottom drops out. Fourth, collapse looks different everywhere. Egypt decentralized. Mesopotamia emptied. The Indus dispersed. Spain dug wells. Cultural, geographic, and political contexts shape how societies respond to identical climate stresses. Fifth, there's no returning to the old world. The post-2200 BC societies were fundamentally different. They had learned from catastrophe. The Middle Bronze Age kingdoms knew they were fragile in ways the Old Kingdom and Akkadian Empire had never imagined. Harvey Weiss, writing in his 2017 volume Megadrought and Collapse, emphasizes that studying these ancient events isn't academic. We live in an era of anthropogenic climate change. Our societies are vastly more complex, more interconnected, more optimized than anything the Bronze Age knew. Our agricultural systems depend on specific temperature ranges, precipitation patterns, seasonal reliability. The 4.2 Kiloyear event is now ratified as the official marker of the Megalayan Age, the current epogeological time. We are living in the age defined by that catastrophe. The International Union of Geological Sciences chose this marker because the event was global in scope, precisely datable in geological records, and had profound impacts on human societies. We have advantages the Akkadians didn't. We understand climate science. We can see changes coming. We have technology, global coordination, the capacity to plan and adapt. But we also have disadvantages. Our population is 8 billion, not millions. Our agricultural lands are already maximized. Our water tables are already depleted. Our societies are staggeringly unequal, and our climate is changing faster than anything in the Holocene record, except volcanic winters. If you've made it this far, you need to subscribe and like this video. Share it. This history matters. The excavations at Tell Leilan continue when conditions allow. Harvey Weiss and teams of archaeologists and paleoclimatologists work to refine our understanding of Bronze Age collapse. Every sediment core, every radiocarbon date, every grain of ancient pollen adds detail to the picture. What they're documenting isn't just the past, it's a preview. Not exactly. Of course, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhythm of 2200 BC is uncomfortably familiar. A civilization at its peak, confident in its permanence, suddenly confronting climate shifts it can't control. The Akkadian scribe who sealed the last jar of barley at Tell Leilan couldn't have imagined their city would lie empty for 3 centuries. The Egyptian priest recording the Nile flood level couldn't have known it was among the last adequate floods of the Old Kingdom. They lived in a world that seemed eternal until the dusk came. We know better now. We know civilizations end. We know climate changes. We know complex systems fail. The question is whether that knowledge translates to action, whether societies can transform before catastrophe forces transformation upon them. The megadrought of 2200 BC ended. The rain returned. But the world it returned to was irrevocably changed. The question facing us is what world will exist when our changes stabilize, and whether the transition will be chosen or forced. Hit that like button, subscribe, and in the comments, tell me what you think. Ancient climate catastrophe teaches us about the present. Let's continue this conversation, because the conversation is how we survive. The past is written in dust and stone. The future is still being written. What we write depends on whether we learn from 20 to 100 BC, or whether we repeat it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, civilizations rise, civilizations fall, but humanity endures. How it endures depends on the choices we make right now.